Agronomist with the Western Winter Wheat Initiative, and today I get to talk about spring assessment. So since January, our winter wheat team has received numerous inquiries from producers and industry about survival. Hopefully today I get to answer or give a little bit of direction on winter survivability. My presentation is going to cover the parameters that affect winter survival. Then I'll go into how to conduct a proper spring assessment, the methods. Then our team, with all inquiries, did really a cross-country checkup. So I'll give what we found in the field, and then finally we'll talk about making that final decision. So to really understand winter survival, we need to take a step back and understand what parameters affect winter survival, as survival is not just one underlying factor, but a compounding effect. So the factors that influence survival are: what was that plant stage going in the fall? What type of snow cover did we have throughout the winter? What were our soil temperatures through the winter? What are variety differences can have an effect on hardiness, or how it affects survivability. And then lastly, there is a little bit of research that indicates perhaps a seed treatment may affect winter survivability. So first off, we really want a well-established crop going into the fall, which means hopefully that those plants were in the three-leaf stage prior to freeze up. Crops that have a poor start in the fall have a higher risk of winter damage. Therefore, the health and the vigor of the crop when it goes into the winter will be the first measure of its ability to withstand later stress. So when you're evaluating a spring, or you're conducting a spring assessment, you should be asking, well, when was that crop seeded? What type of stubble was it seeded into? How deep was it seeded? And what was a target plant count for the fall time? This chart was developed by Bob Lindell and Wendy Schatz, and it really touches on a couple scenarios that the winter wheat field could have been or coming through this winter. So in a perfect scenario, ideally the crop should have been in the three-leaf stage, which means its yield potential is high, it is competitive against weeds, their survival is high, and then more likely the crop will mature right on track. So that's our first row. So then as we move down the chart, or down towards the bottom of the rows, we can see that the later the field is, or the later the plants, or the later the field is seeded, the yield potential drops, it becomes less competitive against weeds, its survivability is lower, and then the crop's maturity is extended. And then, as you can see in the very last row, we're looking at if it didn't germinate, it just sat immobile in the ground, you're looking at maturity days as high as 10 days later than you typically would have seen. So this graph was developed by Manitoba Ag last week, and it really illustrates the soil temperatures in the province throughout the winter with reference to the variety hardiness. So as we can see, we have a low hardiness variety, and followed by a mid hardiness, and then lastly, this last green one, it is a high hardy variety. So that would be something like North Star, for instance. And as you can see, the soil temperatures, the probe was placed roughly at about 1 inch depth, and this is really where the crown of that winter wheat plant should be. So as you can see, it follows the soil temperature at that crown level throughout the winter. So as we can start off here, the beginning of the chart, the winter wheat undergoes a process called, really hardening off in the fall. The plant requires about 8 to 10 or 8 to 12 weeks of growth in the fall for the development of full winter hardiness to develop. As we follow the curve, we can see that the max hardiness is achieved about that midwinter, and then it slowly dehardens as the year progresses. Snow cover is important as it protects the plants from prolonged periods of cold, and as the crown of the plant is really its lifeline. And if the crown has been damaged, the crown has to be damaged, sorry, in order for winter kill to occur. As we can see, the soil temperatures slowly fall, and as they can fluctuate throughout the winter process. It is the soil temperature, when the soil temperature dips below a curve line of the variety is where the potential for injury to occur. Majority of the varieties grown in Western Canada have mid to high hardiness, therefore the potential risk for injury actually didn't really take place until about March. So as we can see in this particular field or location is where the soil temperature dipped below the hardiness of that particular variety. So this is where we are potentially will see damage to occur, and that actually took place around the beginning of March. The question why I was asked actually during the winter quite a bit was, did my plants start to regrow with the warm temperature that took place around that mid-January or February era? More likely not, as the soil temperature at the crown didn't reach the ideal temperature for the plant to deharden and to regrow. The issue that some producers may encounter is a layer of thin ice that might have formed if the snow had melted during the midwinter. So if you know of areas that experience this situation, they're probably more likely to have a higher risk of injury that it would have occurred if the water had pooled in these low-lying areas. Winter hardiness is another factor that affects survival. However, producers should not solely rely on this characteristic when selecting a variety, as fall management practices will influence survival greatly. So to determine the hardiness of a variety, Dr. Brian Fowler developed a technique to measure cold hardiness. I'm not going to go into much detail on how that process is developed, but the cold notes is that the variety will undergo a stress test in the lab, and then it's reassessed in the field. So these numbers are then used to produce a comparative measure of cultivar winter hardiness potential. This measure of winter hardiness potential is also known as the cultivar's field index, so the FSI. As we can see, the North Star's FSI is 514. This is the benchmark that all other varieties are compared to. I've included a fall rye just to really illustrate how hardy it is compared to winter wheat. The older winter wheat varieties have more field support compared to the newer varieties with regards to the field index. So for instance, Moats and Emerson, their FSI could potentially change. So really to help explain that is that currently the Moats FSI is around 488, and that's what we feel in the lab test. However, once assessed in the field with current management practices over about 3 or 4 year period, this number could potentially drop or increase, just depending on what we see in the field. Lastly, I just want to touch on seed treatment. Dr. Brian Barris, through one of his studies, looked at the effects of seed treatment on stand establishment. If a crop is seeded under less than ideal conditions, so for instance, a light seeding rate, or you're seeding past the optimum seeding date for a given area, a seed treatment may increase the chances of survival. So if we look at this picture, we can see in a study that he had a light seeding rate with no seed treatment versus a light seeding rate but with a seed treatment. So as you can see between the two comparisons, the difference in terms of survival is great. Where they weren't really seeing much of a, I guess, a benefit would be when you're seeding at a heavy seeding rate, you're seeding within your ideal seeding window, and you're really doing everything correct. A seed treatment, there was a little bit of difference, but not as significant as if you're compromising your seeding management practices. So moving on, really the best advice I can give you when you're doing a crop assessment is be patient. An interesting fact is that only 9% of winter wheat crops in Western Canada are lost to winter kill, which is really the same amount of winter kill that happens in the state of Kansas. And this is the largest winter wheat state in North America. So then the second step is really to monitor that winter wheat field during spring seeding. And lastly, if you are going out and doing a spring assessment, there are three ways or three methods to do a proper spring assessment. I'm not going to go into the paper or the bag test just for time-wise, frame-wise, but if you are interested in more information, you can contact us and we can give you those methods of how to conduct it. So I'm going to talk about more the in-field test. So brown, dry leaves don't really necessarily indicate winter injury, and an initial flush of new top growth is not really a sign that the crop survived. If you dig up plants from all regions of the field, you should also be looking at, or you should dig also plants up where the highest injury could have occurred. So those are hilltops and the low-lying areas. Ideally, you want to target about 20 to 30 plants per square foot. However, our experience from our team found that even a low plant population of 10 to 15 plants per square foot can still produce a profitable crop. So really the infield test, like I said, you want to dig up several plants throughout the field. You want to look at new root growth. So you want to look at that crown system. You want to peel back the layers of leaves and really find that crown. And like I said, if you see new root growth or a white crown, that's an indication that the plant has survived. If you see perhaps brown area or you're unsure, you can also conduct a paper test and bag test. So like I had mentioned earlier in our presentation, our team received numerous phone calls and emails about winter survival. So we conducted a cross-country checkup really early in most of us did in March. This was really extremely early to do a spring assessment, but we wanted to illustrate and show everyone what we were seeing in the field. So when our flood of phone calls first started coming in, our manager went out to his winter wheat field at the beginning of January near the moose jaw area. As you can see from the pictures, there wasn't very much snow cover. He dug up several plants, and as you can see in the bottom area, doing the bag test, within 3 to 4 days, he already saw new root growth and new top growth. And in this incident, he dug up 10 plants, and there was only one that did not survive. So I wasn't braving the weather in January. I decided to brave the weather in around the end of March in the Edmonton region. Again, as you can see, very little snow cover in that area. I did a bag test as well, or I should say paper test and bag test in combination of each other. And you can see the plants that I've dug up. And within around 3 or 4 days, there was new root growth and top growth as well. And in this situation, I had a 100% recovery. Our agronomist in the Saskatchewan area did her spring assessment same time as I did. As you can see, the plants were well established going into the fall. Very little snow cover again in this area. And then again, within a few days, we saw new root. It's kind of hard to see, but you can see there's new root growth right at the bottom here. And then our Manitoba assessment was done in March again. Ken didn't give me very many photos, so I'm sorry I have to deal with this. But as you can see, the plants that he dug up, you can see that there is new top growth. In this picture, there wasn't bottom growth, but as you can see, the roots were well established. So, last step in making your spring assessment is to make that final decision midway through spring seeding. This will ensure the crop has time to recover, but also gives you time to replant if necessary. It's always good to have a plan B in place, but don't execute that plan until you actually know that you have a problem. So if you decide to keep a struggling crop, the best advice that we can give you is apply an early application of nitrogen. And really, this actually doesn't apply to if you're going to keep a struggling crop. If you have a winter wheat crop, regardless, you should be applying that application of nitrogen as early as possible within that field. If you decide to keep a struggling crop, it's going to act more like a spring wheat crop. It's going to be less competitive with weeds, so you may have to apply a wild oat herbicide. It will be delayed in maturity, so you have a higher risk of insects, and then also exposure to fusarium head blight if you have it in the area. And then lastly, you may take a yield penalty with keeping this crop. But if you decide to terminate a struggling crop, you should really consider, will a late-seeded crop out-yield a poor winter wheat crop? And then also, with a little bit of management practices and a little bit of TLC, will that crop actually bounce back? So you have to consider that as well. But in the final decision, if you decide to terminate that crop, we recommend spraying out all the winter wheat. This will help break that disease. For instance, if you have stripe rust in the area, that will hopefully help break that disease. And then lastly, remember to credit any spring applied nitrogen to the following crop. So in conclusion, there is not really one factor that will play into the winter wheat survival, but numerous factors. Overall, from what our team has seen in the field in terms of assessment, we're really seeing low amount of injury throughout the prairie provinces. And lastly, if anything, you take one message away from this presentation, it is to be patient and to give that time or that crop time to recover. It was a harsh winter. Thank you so much.